Your position is eliminated, effective immediately.
I have a 6-year-old boy waiting at home.
This is a 5-star hotel. People like you need to leave.
I only need a few minutes to get warm.
Escort her out.
Why did you stop when everyone else walked past?
I lost my job this morning.
Then why give half to me? Daniel, I am Catherine Voss.
The woman on the bench was you.
I own the hotel that threw me out.
You did not protect the brand. You decided who deserved to be treated like a human being.
I was only doing my job.
Thanks for watching. Follow A Brighter Destiny for more powerful stories, and don't forget to subscribe.
On the worst morning of my life, I had $14.62 to my name, a sore 6-year-old boy waiting for me at home, and no idea that in 11 hours I would be sitting on a park bench giving away the last hot meal I could afford. I want to tell you this story slowly, because it deserves to be told slowly, and because I still don't fully understand how one torn open Tuesday can hold both the worst thing that ever happened to me and the best thing that ever happened to me at the exact same time. I'm not going to pretend I'm some kind of hero. I'm just going to tell you what happened, plainly, the way it happened, and let you decide what it means. Before I get into it, I'll say one thing, and then let the story run. I'm not a man who's comfortable asking for anything from anybody. So I'm not going to beg you to stay until the end. I'll just say that if you've ever had your whole life come apart in a single morning, or if you've ever wondered whether a small kindness actually changes anything in this world, then this one is for you. My name is Daniel Merrick. I'm 38 years old, and back when this happened, I drove a forklift on the loading dock of a distribution warehouse on the edge of Kansas City. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the rent, and it let me raise my son the way I wanted to raise him, which was the only thing in this world I actually cared about. His name is Eli. He's 6. His mother, my wife Sarah, died 2 years ago after a short and vicious fight with an illness saw coming. And from the day I buried her, my entire life folded down into one single job description, which was keeping that boy fed, safe, and unafraid. That's the whole resume. Everything else was just noise around it. At 9:52 in the morning, on a Tuesday that started like every other Tuesday, my shift supervisor called 11 of us into the break room and told us the warehouse was restructuring its overnight logistics contract, and that our positions were being eliminated effective immediately. No warning, no transition period. To folder, a final check for $647.13 and a security escort to make sure we cleared out our lockers without lingering. I stood in that parking lot holding a cardboard box with my work boots and a photograph of Eli taped inside my locker door, and I felt the ground disappear from underneath a life I thought I had finally stabilized. I want you to understand what that kind of loss actually feels like, because it isn't loud. Nobody screams at you. Nobody even looks you in the eye for very long. You just get handed a box, and the world keeps moving at exactly the same speed it was moving 5 minutes earlier, except your entire foundation has just quietly caved in underneath you. I stood there doing math I did not want to do. Rent was due in 11 days. I had $14.62 in my pocket and $41 in my checking account until that final paycheck cleared, which would take at least 3 business days. I had a 6-year-old at home who did not yet know that his father had just become, once again, the only thing standing between him and disaster. There's a particular kind of shame that comes with a layoff like that one, and nobody warns you about it ahead of time. It isn't loud and it isn't dramatic. Nobody raises their voice. Somebody hands you a folder and a check. A coworker you've stood next to for 3 years suddenly finds the floor tiles very interesting, and then you're standing in the sun in a parking lot holding a cardboard box while the rest of the world keeps moving at exactly the same speed it was moving 10 minutes earlier. Some animal part of you starts whispering that you failed, that you should have seen it coming, that you are somehow less of a man than you were an hour ago. None of that is true. All of it feels true anyway. I stood in that parking lot thinking about Sarah, about the promise I'd made her near the end, The one where I told her I would always take care of our boy, no matter what. Looked. And for one long, cold minute, I felt like I was breaking that promise in a parking lot on a Tuesday morning over something that had nothing at all to do with me. I walked the long way home that morning because I could not yet face the version of the conversation I was going to have with Eli. Looked. Somewhere along that walk, I stopped at a small diner 2 blocks from our apartment and spent $8.40, nearly 2/3 of what I had left in the world, on a hot meal to go. Looked. I know exactly how that sounds. Looked. I know the sensible thing would have been to save every dollar and stretch it into rice and beans for 3 days. Looked. But Eli lost his mother when he was 4 years old, and I had spent every day since then rebuilding, brick by brick, a world for him that felt safe and warm and predictable, where dinner always showed up on time and Daddy always had it handled. Looked. I was about to have to crack that world open and tell him things were going to be hard for a while, and I could not bring myself to deliver that news over a bowl of plain noodles. Looked. I wanted him to have one more good, ordinary, happy dinner before the worry moved in. Looked. So I spent the money. Looked. I would spend it again tomorrow if I had to make the same choice all over. Looked. On the way home, my route cut through Founders Square, a small downtown park that sits directly across the street from the Ashfaido Grand Hotel, 22 stories of glass and gold trim that had gone up 4 years earlier and become, almost overnight, the most photographed building in the city. Looked. And on a bench near the fountain, in the cold, sat a woman who, by every visible measure, had absolutely nothing. Looked. Layers of mismatched clothing pulled tight against the wind. Looked. A torn canvas bag beside her. Looked. Gray, hollow-cheeked, hunched into herself the way a body folds when it has been cold for a very long time. Looked. She was shaking, the deep kind of shaking that doesn't stop when you tell it to. Looked. She wasn't asking anyone for anything. Looked. She was simply enduring, the way people endure once the world has quietly decided to stop seeing them. Looked. Here is the detail that has stayed lodged in me ever since. Looked. The park was not empty. Looked. There were dozens of people crossing through it at that exact moment, well-dressed people, hotel guests with rolling suitcases, professionals on lunch break, carrying paper cups from the cafe across the street. Looked. Every single one of them walked past that bench without a flicker of hesitation, the way you walk past a lamppost. Looked. Not one of them slowed down. Looked. Not one of them looked at her twice. Looked. I watched it happen for almost a full minute before I moved, and something about it worked its way under my skin. Looked. It wasn't that any of those people were cruel. Looked. It's that comfort has a way of making suffering invisible, if you let it, and most of them had gotten very good at not letting themselves see her at all. Looked. I sat down next to her without really deciding to. Looked. I think some part of me, the part that had just spent a morning discovering exactly how fast the floor can vanish beneath a person, could not look at her and see a stranger. I looked at her and saw a version of myself a few bad weeks further down the same road I had just started walking. Looked. I opened the container from the diner, split the meal into 2 roughly equal halves, and held one out to her. Looked. I told her it was still warm, and that she should eat something. Looked. She stared at my hand for a long moment, like she genuinely could not process what was happening, and then she took it with fingers that were visibly trembling, and we sat there together on that cold bench and ate in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable at all. Looked. At one point she asked me, very quietly, why I had stopped when no one else had. Looked. I told her the truth, because I didn't have the energy to dress it up in anything else. Looked. I told her I'd lost my job that same morning, that this was very nearly the last of what I had, and that I had a 6-year-old at home I was going to have to figure out how to feed. Looked. She went still when I said that. Looked. She asked why on earth I would give half of it away then. Looked. I told her something my own mother used to say to me over a lot of thin dinners when I was young, which is that anybody can be generous when they've got plenty to spare, but it's the people with empty pockets who actually keep this world from freezing over. She didn't say anything back. Looked. But I saw her eyes fill up, and I assumed it was simply the surprise of being treated like a person, after what I would later learn had been an extremely long and extremely ugly day. Looked. I had no idea that I had just handed her the exact argument she had spent the whole afternoon losing faith in. I gave her the $6 and change I had left in my coat pocket, told her to get somewhere warm, and stood up to walk the rest of the way home to my son. She asked my name. I told her. She said, "Thank you, Daniel. You have no idea what you've just done." And I smiled and told her it was nothing. Because as far as I understood in that moment, it truly was nothing. Half a sandwich and some pocket change. I walked home, sat my boy down, and found the gentlest words I could to tell him that things were going to be tight for a while. And I genuinely believed that was the end of it. Now let me tell you what that afternoon had actually been for her, because I only learned the full shape of it much later, and it changes everything about how I understand that day. Before I tell you about the bench, I have to take you back a few hours, to what her day had already been before I ever crossed her path, because none of the rest of this makes sense without it. Her name is Catherine Voss. Everyone who knew her called her Kate. And she was not homeless. She was the founder and majority owner of Voss Hospitality Group, the parent company that owned, among 11 properties across 4 states, the Ashford Grand Hotel standing directly across the street from that bench. She was, by any reasonable measure, one of the wealthiest women in the entire region, a name that would have been instantly recognized by anyone who followed business news in that city. Kate had built her company from a single roadside motel over 22 years, and somewhere along the climb to 11 properties and a board of directors, she had lost almost all contact with what her decisions actually felt like on the ground, for the people living underneath them. She was 3 days away from approving a sweeping cost reduction plan across all 11 properties, a plan drafted by consultants that would cut housekeeping staff by a third, eliminate guaranteed hours for front desk workers, and quietly reclassify hundreds of employees to strip them of benefits. It was the kind of decision that reads as a single clean number in a boardroom and lands as a catastrophe in 1,000 separate kitchens. Something in her rebelled against signing it without understanding what it would actually do. So she did something reckless. She told no one but her driver, left her phone, her assistant, and every card in her wallet behind, dressed herself in worn, mismatched clothing, and spent one entire day in her own city as an invisible woman with nothing. She wanted to feel, before she signed anything, what it was actually like to stand on the ground floor of the world she was about to reshape. She told me later that it was the most devastating day of her adult life, because for 9 straight hours she experienced, for the first time, what it feels like to be looked through rather than looked at. It started small, the way these things always do. A bus driver closed the doors 2 feet in front of her at 8:15 that morning and pulled away without so much as glancing in his mirror. By 10 o'clock she had been asked to leave a coffee shop for loitering, 4 minutes after walking in with no money and nowhere else to get warm. The barista telling her, not unkindly but not gently either, that the tables were for paying customers. Around noon, a woman walking with a small child on the sidewalk outside a bakery had physically steered the child to the far side of the pavement, eyes tightening with something between distaste and fear, as though Kate might be contagious simply by proximity. Kate told me that moment was the one that actually broke something loose in her, standing there in the cold watching a stranger flinch away from her like she was a hazard rather than human being, who had 24 hours earlier been signing checks for a children's hospital wing. And at 2:30 in the afternoon, cold to the bone and shaking hard enough that her teeth had started to ache, Kate had walked into the lobby of her own hotel, the Ashford Grand, simply to stand somewhere warm for a few minutes, unrecognized in her own building. The general manager on duty that afternoon was a woman named Victoria Lang, 44 years old, who had run the Ashford Grand's front-of-house operations since it opened and had built her entire professional identity around what she called maintaining the brand standard. Victoria spotted Kate within 90 seconds of her entering the lobby, crossed the marble floor directly toward her, and, in front of at least a dozen guests checking in for a wedding block that weekend, told her loudly that this was a five-star establishment and that people like her needed to leave before she called building security. Kate tried to explain quietly that she only wanted to sit for a few minutes to get warm. Victoria told her that the lobby furniture was not a public shelter and physically gestured a security guard over before Kate had even finished her sentence. Kate was walked out through the revolving doors of her own hotel while paying guests watched and said nothing, and she told me she had never in her adult life felt smaller than she did crossing back to the park, back toward the bench, where 20 minutes later, a laid-off warehouse worker with almost nothing left in his own pockets would sit down beside her and split his last meal in half. Victoria Lang was, by every account I would later hear, not a cruel person in the way people picture cruelty. She was instead someone deeply, genuinely convinced that what she had done was correct. She believed she was protecting the standards of a building she had given 2 decades of her life to. She would say, when it all eventually came apart, that she had simply been doing her job, and she would keep saying it, in one form or another, for a very long time, long after saying it stopped helping her at all. Kate walked back out through those revolving doors into the cold, with the eyes of a dozen strangers still on her back, crossed the street toward Founders Square, and lowered herself onto the nearest bench because her legs, by that point, had genuinely stopped being reliable. She told me she sat there turning over one flat, hollow thought in her mind, over and over, that this was what she actually was underneath the money, that this was how much people actually cared about one another once the money was gone, which was to say not at all. She said she had come within a few quiet minutes of deciding that, for good, of writing off an entire species she had spent 22 years building an empire on top of. And that is exactly the state she was in when a laid-off warehouse worker, with $14 to his name, sat down beside her and without a shred of hesitation split his last hot meal in half. I didn't hear anything for almost 4 weeks after that day on the bench. I was deep in the grinding, humiliating work of applying for anything I could find, stretching every dollar until it was translucent, lying awake at 2 a.m. running numbers that never came out right. And then, on a Thursday afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and a woman identifying herself as an executive assistant asked whether I would be available to come in for a conversation at the Voss Hospitality Group corporate offices downtown. I assumed it was one of the dozen applications I'd thrown out into the void, finally landing somewhere. I put on my one good shirt, the one I'd worn to Sarah's funeral, and I went. I was led into an off the 19th floor with a view stretching clean across the whole skyline, and behind the desk stood a sharply dressed, composed woman I did not recognize at first, because my brain simply refused to connect her to the shaking, hollow-eyed woman I had last seen on a park bench in torn clothing. It was only when she stood and looked directly at me that I recognized the eyes. It was her. I stood there in that doorway with my mouth genuinely open, unable to reconcile the 2 pictures colliding inside my head at once. She came around the desk, took both of my hands, and told me everything. The disguise, the 9 hours of being invisible. What had happened in the lobby of her own hotel that afternoon, at the hands of her own general manager. And what it had meant at the very bottom of that day to have exactly one person in an entire city choose to stop. She told me she had spent real effort tracking me down with almost nothing to go on beyond a first name and a face, because she could not let what I'd done simply disappear into the ordinary noise of the world. And then she offered me a position at Voss Hospitality Group in logistics and facilities coordination, salaried, with full benefits and real stability, the kind of footing I had been terrified I might never find again after that parking lot. She was careful, very deliberately careful, to frame it as a job and not a gift. She told me people that she had spent 22 years surrounded by people who had every advantage in the world and had rarely seen character like what I had shown her on that bench, and that she would be a fool as a businesswoman not to want someone like that working inside her company. I took the job, obviously. It gave my son and me our life back, on solid ground, and had let me tell Eli, once things had already turned out all right, a very different version of the hard time story than the one I had been dreading having to tell him while we were still falling. But the job was never the part of this story that mattered most to me. What mattered most came after. Kate did not quietly move on from what had happened to her in that lobby. She launched a full internal investigation into Victoria Lang's conduct as general manager, and what surfaced over the following 6 weeks went far beyond a single bad afternoon with an unrecognized owner. 3 former guests came forward once word of the investigation reached them, each with a story that had, until then, simply been absorbed and forgotten the way these things usually are. This was Renee Coldwell, a single mother of 2 who had booked a room at the Ashford Grand for her daughter's out-of-town dance competition, paid in full in advance, and been told at the front desk in front of her children that the reservation had been given away because Victoria did not believe, based on Renee's appearance after a 9-hour drive, that she could cover incidentals. The second was Walter Briggs, a 71-year-old disabled veteran who had been left waiting 40 minutes for accessible transport assistance, while Victoria personally prioritized a party of guests she considered more valuable to the hotel's image, later telling a colleague, within Walter's hearing, that he was bad for the lobby atmosphere. The third was Diane Foss, a young mother traveling alone with an infant who had asked to use a private area to nurse and been redirected to a maintenance closet because Victoria did not want, in her words, that kind of thing happening near the check-in desk. None of these people had filed formal complaints. Most of them had simply absorbed the humiliation the way people without power usually have to, and moved on because fighting back rarely feels like it's worth what it costs. Renee told the investigators she had cried in the hotel parking garage that night with her daughters asleep in the back seat, then never spoke of it again because she had 2 competitions left that season and could not afford to make herself a problem in small industry where reputations travel fast. Walter said he had simply stopped booking hotels downtown altogether, quietly rerouting his life around a building he no longer trusted without ever telling anyone why. Diane said she had gone home and cried harder than she had in the entire 8 months since her son was born, not over the closet itself, but over how casually it had been offered to her, as though it were obviously the right solution and she was the one being unreasonable for minding. But once the investigation opened a door, all 3 came forward within days of each other, and their accounts, laid side by side in a single conference room, painted a portrait of a manager who had spent years quietly deciding, guest by guest, who deserved dignity and who didn't, and had simply never once been asked to answer for it. What struck the investigators most, according to someone who sat in on those interviews, was not any single incident on its own. It was how identical the pattern was every time. A quick, silent visual judgment. A decision made in under a minute. And then a justification delivered afterward with total confidence that framed cruelty as professionalism. Victoria Lang was terminated from Voss Hospitality Group 11 days after the investigation concluded. She never apologized, not once, not even at the very end. In her exit meeting, according to 2 people who were present, she told HR that everything she had done had been in service of protecting the Ashford brand, and that she stood by every decision she had made. Kate later told me that watching Victoria hold that line, even with her career, her reputation, and eventually a discrimination lawsuit from Renee Coldwell collapsing around her, was the single clearest example she had ever seen of a person choosing the story they'd already decided about themselves over the truth sitting directly in front of them. Victoria's refusal to reflect, even once, cost her far more in the end than a simple apology ever would have. The lawsuit settled quietly 8 months later. She has not worked in hospitality management since. What changed inside Voss Hospitality Group mattered more than what happened to any one person, Victoria included. Really looked? Kate scrapped the cost reduction plan entirely, the one she had been 3 days from signing before that afternoon on the bench, and replaced it with something far more expensive to run and far better for the people underneath it. Guaranteed hours were restored and expanded across all 11 properties. A direct, anonymous reporting line was created so that any employee could flag guest mistreatment without fear of retaliation from a manager. Front desk staff were given real authority to override a manager's judgment call if a guest was clearly being treated unfairly because of how they looked. None of it made headlines. None of the housekeeping staff or front desk workers whose hours were quietly protected that year will ever know that any of it traces back to half a sandwich shared on a cold bench in Founders Square. They will simply have a little more security and a little more dignity in their working lives, and never know why. I have come to believe that might be the best part of the whole thing. A kindness can travel that far from where you first set it down, touch hundreds of people you will never meet, and ask absolutely nothing of them in return, not even to be known about. On the day my first full paycheck cleared from the new position, I took Eli back to that same small diner, bought the exact same meal I had, bought the morning I lost everything, and carried it across the street to that same bench in Founders Square. I told him, in the plain, simple way you tell true things to a 6-year-old, that once, on this very bench, Daddy had shared his dinner with a cold stranger on the worst day he could remember, and that it had turned out to be one of the best things he had ever done. I don't know exactly how much of it landed. He's 6, but he still asks to go back to that bench sometimes, so I think some of it did. I have lived on both sides of that particular line now, the side with almost nothing, and the side with enough, and I will tell you plainly what I believe is one of the truest things I have ever learned. The people who have the least are, more often than not, the ones who give the most, not because they are somehow better than anyone else, but because they still remember, in their bodies, exactly what it costs to be looked through. It is easy to walk past a stranger's suffering when you have never come close to it yourself. It becomes very hard to do once you know, firsthand, how cold that bench actually is. I think about Victoria sometimes too, and not with much anger left in me, honestly. I think about how she never once, not at the hearing, not in the exit meeting, not in the 18 months since, allowed herself to say the 2 words that might have changed how any of it ended for her. I'm sorry. She held on to the story she had already decided about herself, the one where she was simply protecting a standard right up until that story cost her the only career she had ever built. I don't know that I understand people like that completely. But I know that refusing to bend, even once, when the truth is standing directly in front of you, tends to break something far more expensive than pride eventually. I don't tell people this story to make myself sound like something I'm not. I tell it because I think about that afternoon almost every single day, about how close I came to simply walking past like everyone else did, about how the entire chain of everything that followed, my job, Kate's decision to scrap that plan, 3 people finally being heard, hundreds of workers quietly, protected, hinged on one exhausted, broke man deciding not to keep walking for 1 more minute. You never know, when you sit down next to someone, exactly what you're setting in motion. Most of the time, nothing at all comes back to you, and it's worth doing anyway. And every once in a while, you find out you were sitting next to someone who could change more lives than you will ever be able to count. If you've ever been down to your very last dollar and found out something true about who you actually are in that moment, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and it's the stories from people who had no real margin left to be kind, and were kind anyway, that stay with me the longest. And if this one meant something to you, there's a subscribe button right below this video, and I'd genuinely be glad to have you back for the next one. Until then, here's the only thing I really want you to carry out of this. Somewhere today, you are going to walk past someone the rest of the world has already decided not to see. You don't need to wait until you have plenty to spare before you're kind to them. That day may never come. Sit down. Share what you have, even if it's almost nothing. You never really know who's sitting on that bench. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person, living or dead, or any actual establishment. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. It does not make factual claims about any individual company or institution.